The night shift at Mercy General in Raleigh moved like a held breath, everything necessary, nothing wasted. Sarah Chen pushed the medication cart down the third-floor corridor at 2:22 a.m., her scrubs hanging loose enough that the scars mapping her spine stayed invisible, her movements so economical they seemed almost choreographed. The fluorescent lights hummed their relentless drone overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional green that made skin look diseased. She didn't notice anymore. Her hands moved through the routine with the precision of someone who'd once done this under mortar fire, swapping out 4 bags with the same care she'd once used clearing buildings in Ramadi, 1 room at a time, 1 patient at a time, 1 breath at a time. In her locker downstairs, tucked beneath her spare scrubs and a folded hospital towel, sat a pair of worn combat boots. The leather had cracked into a map of its own geography. The laces were still laced exactly how she'd left them 7 years ago. Before each shift, Sarah would open the locker door, touch the boots once, just the toe of the left one, like a talisman, like a prayer she didn't have words for anymore, then close the locker and climb the stairs back into the fluorescent light where nobody knew her name and she preferred it that way. The medication cart clicked into the supply room at 3:15 a.m. Sarah began prepping the intubation kit for the night, endotracheal tubes in ascending sizes, laryngoscope with fresh batteries, curved blade at 45 degrees, then the straight blade angled toward the vocal cords. Her hands found each instrument before her eyes registered them. A muscle memory so deep it predated her conscious mind. Back in Ramadi, she'd intubated a Marine with shrapnel in his throat using a flashlight and a prayer. Here at Mercy General, she had better light. Better tools. Steadier hands, maybe, or maybe just hands that had learned the difference between things worth shaking about and things that were simply work. One of the day shift nurses, Jennifer, passed by the supply room doorway. She glanced in, saw Sarah's hands moving through the kit, and didn't bother to watch. Nobody watched the night shift nurse who kept her head down and completed her charting and never, ever challenged orders. Dr. James Hargrove arrived for rounds at 3:45 a.m., sweeping through the 3rd floor with the territorial assessment of a predator counting prey. His shoes clicked against the tile with a sound like a metronome keeping time to something only he could hear. Sarah noted the timing from her position at the nursing station. Hargrove always arrived in the last quarter of the night shift, when the skeleton crew was too tired to ask questions, when the morning surgical team hadn't arrived yet, when documentation moved slower than the actual work. She'd been tracking his patterns for 3 weeks now, the way a soldier tracks enemy movement, not out of fear, but out of something closer to professional interest. The way he scanned the floor for patients with Medicaid cards. The way he diverted the wealthy self-pay cases toward his team and away from others. The way his voice changed depending on which insurance card he was looking at. Last week, Sarah had noticed the billing discrepancies in 3 patient charts. A routine knee arthroscopy billed as emergency surgery. A diabetic wound care classified as complex trauma requiring specialist consultation. A standard EKG flagged as a cardiac workup. The inflated charges climbed from the paperwork like vines. Sarah had made the mistake of pulling Hargrove aside in the hallway, keeping her voice soft, keeping her hands visible, keeping everything deferential the way she'd learned to do 7 years ago. "Doctor, I noticed the billing on these 3 cases doesn't seem to match the actual procedures documented. I wanted to bring it to your attention before the claim goes through." She'd said it like a question. Like she was asking permission to breathe. His response had been sharp enough to draw blood. "Nursing doesn't review physician billing decisions, Ms. Chen. Stay in your lane." The way he'd said her name made it sound like an insult. Like Ms. Chen was shorthand for something small and forgettable. He'd walked away before she could respond, which meant no response had been necessary. The message was clear: you see nothing, you report nothing, you remember nothing. She understood messages like that. She'd lived in messages like that for 12 months in Ramadi, where the wrong word could get you killed and the right silence could save your life. But last Tuesday, something had shifted. Hargrove had walked past her station while she was documenting a patient's post-op vitals, and his voice had dropped just low enough for her to hear it over the ventilator's mechanical wheeze. "Nurses making billing decisions now? That's adorable. almost like she thinks she's competent. He'd said it to another resident, but loud enough that Sarah would catch it. Loud enough that 3 other staff members would hear it. She'd kept her hands on the keyboard. Kept her eyes on the screen. Kept breathing at the same measured pace. The trembling wasn't fear. The trembling, if there had been any, and she wouldn't let anyone see it, was restraint. Pure, crystalline restraint, the kind that comes from having already survived the worst the world has to offer. After he'd passed, she'd finished her documentation. Her handwriting never wavered. Never even hesitated. Then came the comment in front of the night shift team. Thursday at 2 a.m., Hargrove doing rounds again, moving through the ICU with that same predatory precision. He'd stopped at her station and gestured toward a patient chart she was reviewing. "You know, Chen, I admire your initiative. It's cute that you think nursing school gave you the tools to understand complex billing structures. Almost makes you seem less like you're just pushing papers and more like you actually belong here." He'd smiled while he said it. The smile made it worse somehow, because it meant he believed it. He believed she was beneath him. He believed that questioning him had been presumptuous. He believed she was nothing. Sarah had looked up from the chart. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. She'd said nothing. The silence stretched like pulled taffy. Then she'd returned her attention to her documentation, and Hargrove had moved on to the next room, already dismissing her from his mind. But the isolation had already begun its mathematics. Friday morning, when the day shift supervisor had come to brief Sarah on the incoming patients, the conversation had shifted slightly. Not overtly. Nothing a lawyer could point to. Just a subtle reframing. Dr. Hargrove mentioned you might be more comfortable with non-critical care assignments. He thought it would be a better fit for your skills. Sarah had nodded. Had accepted the reassignment without comment. Had watched as Hargrove's allies, 2 residents who orbited him like planets around a dying star, began finding reasons to redirect questions away from her, to pass her cases to other nurses, to ensure she stayed in the slower corner of the floor where her competence couldn't challenge anyone's empire. It was textbook professional sabotage. It was also smart. It was also building a case. By keeping her isolated, by boxing her into low acuity patients, Hargrove was creating a paper trail. Look how she requested reassignment, look how she works at her own pace now, look how she's not carrying the critical cases anymore. When the time came to fire her, and Sarah could feel the momentum building toward that moment like weather approaching on the horizon, he would have documentation. She would look like a voluntary demotion. Like she'd admitted her own inadequacy. At 4:20 a.m., the ER alert system crackled, incoming trauma, ETA 6 minutes. Sarah was already moving before the page finished transmitting, pulling on a fresh pair of gloves, mentally cataloguing which supplies would be needed for an emergency arrival. The kind of patient who came in at 4 in the morning usually came in hard. She could hear the ambulance bay doors opening 2 floors below, could hear the paramedics' radios crackling like distant gunfire, could hear the organized chaos that meant bodies were coming. She was reviewing the trauma protocol checklist when the ER nurse called up to her station. "Chen, can you come down? We've got an incoming, looks like he's deaf, signing to the paramedics, going to need specific communication accommodations. You're the most patient with complex cases." It wasn't a compliment. It was assignment by demographic. But Sarah was already heading for the stairs. The ambulance bay at 4:26 a.m. smelled like diesel exhaust and ozone from the defibrillator units. A Marine in a transfer wheelchair, arms covered in tattoos, one eye swollen shut from blunt force trauma, hands moving in the tactical sign language that crossed all the military branches. Someone had beaten him. Recently. The paramedic was breathing hard as he relayed vitals. Deaf male, approximately 40, sustained multiple blunt force injuries, responsive but minimally verbal, refusing pain medication, requesting information on his legal status. Sarah approached from his line of sight so she wouldn't startle him, moving slow, keeping her hands visible. She could read tactical signing. Most people didn't realize that about her. His eyes tracked to her face, dark and alert despite the trauma. And then something flickered there. Something like recognition, like a door opening onto a place both of them had been. Sarah's breath caught. Just for a moment. Just enough that she knew something had changed. She could see his forearm as the paramedics wheeled him past her, the intricate ink on his skin, a faded tattoo in flowing script that read, Angel Chen. The room around Sarah seemed to tilt slightly. 7 years. 7 years of silence. 7 years of being no one. 7 years of combat boots in a locker, untouched except for the ritual of the morning prayer. And now here was the past, rolling in on a wheelchair, wearing the face of a man she thought she'd already mourned. She didn't move. She didn't react. She kept her composure absolute, locked down tighter than a vault door. But her mind was already running tactical assessment. Who was he? Where had he been? What was he doing in Raleigh at 4 in the morning with his face beaten in? And most importantly, did he know? Did he recognize her? Or had she become so skilled at vanishing that even the person whose life she'd once saved wouldn't know her name? The paramedics pushed him toward the trauma bay. Hargrove was already there, scanning the patient with that same predatory assessment, reading the Medicaid card being handed to him, and something shifted in his expression. Something like disappointment. A complex, low-acuity case. A Medicaid patient. Someone who would require time and resources with minimal prestige and maximum liability. Sarah could read that calculation on his face like it was written in neon. And then Hargrove looked up at her, standing in the doorway, and smiled that same smile he'd smiled in the supply room. The one that meant he knew exactly what she was, what she wasn't, and how useful she could be in the next part of his plan. Sarah moved toward the trauma bay with her hand steady and her mind already 3 steps ahead, watching the pattern form. Here was a patient nobody would fight for, here was a case designed for abandonment, here was the setup for whatever came next. The stretcher arrived at 3:53 a.m. Marcus Rivera lay on it with his eyes closed, his left arm exposed to the fluorescent glare, and there it was, faded but unmistakable on his forearm, Angel Chen written in military script. Sarah's breath caught somewhere between her ribs. She forced herself to look away, to move, to function. The chart read bilateral sensorineural hearing loss, profound. IED blast, Ramadi, 7 years prior. Multiple shrapnel scars. Medicaid. Dr. Hargrove was waiting at the trauma bay entrance like a wolf at a watering hole. His eye scanned the insurance card the way a sommelier scans a wine list, with calculation and barely concealed disdain. "We lack appropriate communication resources for this level of complexity," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of institutional certainty. It wasn't a question. It was a closing statement. He turned to Dr. Patel, who was standing 2 feet away, and held out the chart. "Your patient, Doctor." Patel's jaw tightened. He glanced at Marcus Rivera, then at Hargrove's expression, that particular blend of authority and threat that made younger doctors understand compliance was mandatory. "Actually, I'm about to hand off to the day shift. Not my specialty anyway. Communication barrier cases require." He was already moving toward the exit, already gesturing to Dr. Kim. "You take him." Dr. Kim received the chart like someone accepting a loaded weapon they'd never trained with. She read it for exactly 4 seconds. "Liability concerns," she said flatly. "We need time to coordinate with the hospital interpreter. He's not available until Monday. Can't proceed without proper communication protocols." She was already walking, already passing the chart to Dr. Morrison, who took it the way a person touches something contaminated. "Not my specialty," Morrison said. "Trauma's not my lane." He handed it to Dr. Bennett. Bennett read it once and shook his head. "Too complicated for a shift change. I'm clocking out in 6 minutes." Dr. Castellano came next. Then Dr. Okonkwo. Then Dr. Silva. Each refusal a small stone added to a wall, each doctor's voice slightly quieter than the last, as if volume could somehow muffle the sound of abandonment. Sarah watched it happen, really watched it, her hands gripping the edge of the nurse's station counter so hard her knuckles went white. 11 doctors had passed the chart like it was contaminated. 12, if you counted Hargrove's initial refusal. 12. The number crystallized in her mind with perfect clarity. She'd been counting without meaning to, the way soldiers count ammunition or casualties or reasons to stay breathing when staying breathing felt impossible. Her jaw was locked so tight she thought her teeth might crack. She could feel her pulse in her temples, a rhythm like distant explosions. Hargrove stood near the ambulance bay, arms crossed, watching her watch the refusals happen. He was smiling. Not a real smile, nothing with warmth or humanity in it. This was the expression of a man who'd orchestrated a symphony and was enjoying the applause from an audience of one nurse who understood exactly what she was seeing, the systematic dismantling of a patient's right to care, conducted by someone with enough power to make it look like protocol. Sarah caught his eye for half a second. He winked. That was when she understood he wasn't just refusing treatment. He was demonstrating something. He was showing her that he could move people like chess pieces. That he could make institutions bend. That her objections, her questions about inflated charges, her quiet concern about the 3 patients he'd billed for procedures they never received, meant nothing against the weight of his network. She turned back to Marcus Rivera, who was still lying on the stretcher with his eyes closed, unaware that 12 doctors had just voted on whether his life was worth their time. At 6 a.m., the cafeteria was filling with day shift staff. Sarah carried her breakfast tray, coffee, oatmeal, dry toast, through the maze of tables toward an empty seat in the corner. She kept her eyes forward, the way you move through dangerous territory, head down, shoulders neutral, nothing in your expression to invite conversation. Dr. Hargrove was at the coffee station. He turned and stepped directly into her path. "I'm betting Nurse Chen here quits within a week," he announced to the gathering crowd, his voice pitched to Carrie. "Anyone want in on this action? I've got $20 saying she walks before Friday." Laughter rippled through the room. The easy, comfortable laughter of people secure in their power, watching someone without any. Sarah kept walking. Hargrove moved to intercept her. He was taller, broader, and he used his body like a barrier. Up close, she could smell cologne and coffee and something underneath that, sweat with a chemical edge, the scent of adrenaline in someone who was enjoying himself too much. His hand came up and struck her breakfast tray from below, the motion casual as brushing away an insect. The tray went airborne. Coffee splashed across the linoleum floor like a stain spreading through water. Oatmeal scattered. Toast tumbled. The sound of the tray hitting the ground was like a gunshot in the sudden silence. The room had gone absolutely still, the kind of quiet that comes when witnesses realize they're watching something cross from acceptable to unacceptable. Hargrove threw Marcus Rivera's chart at her feet. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice warm as a handshake. "Since you seem so concerned about charity cases." Sarah knelt slowly. The movements were deliberate, controlled, nothing rushed or emotional. She was aware of every eye in the room. She was aware of his proximity, his satisfaction, the way his shadow fell across the scattered pages. A single tear escaped down her right cheek. She didn't try to hide it. She simply wiped it away with her left hand while maintaining eye contact, and when she spoke, her voice came out steady as a held breath, carrying the particular calm that comes from having already survived the worst things a human body can endure. "I've picked up heavier things than your insecurities, Doctor." His smile froze. The kind of freeze that happens when someone realizes they've miscalculated, when they've pushed toward a wall expecting resistance and found steel instead. The room went dead silent. Not awkward. Not uncomfortable. The silence of witnesses understanding they'd just watched something irreversible happen. Sarah gathered the scattered pages of Marcus Rivera's chart, stood, and carried them out of the cafeteria without looking back. Behind her, someone had started their coffee. Someone else was repositioning their chair. The machinery of the hospital was moving again, resuming its rhythm, but something had shifted in the air current, a small current of resistance where there had been only compliance before. At 2:34 p.m., the records room was empty except for Sarah. The afternoon light came through the single high window in long columns of dust. She pulled Marcus Rivera's intake file and opened it to the intake photographs. The images showed a man with dark eyes, jaw clenched against pain, hands trembling from blood loss or shock or both. His left forearm was visible in the side-angle shot. The tattoo was unmistakable in every particular, Angel Chen written in military script, the kind of permanent marking soldiers got for soldiers they'd loved or soldiers who'd saved their lives. She'd carried him 5 miles. Through streets that smelled like diesel and cordite and something else underneath, the copper smell of blood mixing with dust. His hearing was already gone by the time she found him, the IED's blast having destroyed the delicate structures in his inner ear, leaving him in a silence so complete it was almost merciful. She'd signed to him the whole way, even though he couldn't hear the words themselves, communicating through hand shapes and facial expressions and the pure transmission of presence, "You are going to survive. I have you. The angel is real." His eyes had looked up at her with such desperate gratitude that she'd almost believed she was the thing he thought she was, something divine, something untouchable by the ordinary violence of the world. Now those same eyes had looked through her without recognition. They'd slid across her face in the trauma bay with the blank regard of a stranger. 7 years. War changes people. Hearing loss changes how the world shapes itself in your mind. But Sarah understood in that moment what the real change was. Marcus Rivera didn't know who'd saved him that night. She was just another face in another hospital. Just another person moving through his life without a name. She closed the file and sat very still in the dust and light. Her hands were beginning to tremble, so she pressed them flat against the metal desk until they stopped. The trembling wasn't fear. The trembling was restraint, the precise muscular control required to keep 11 years of classified military service, of choices made in darkness, of lives held together by pure will and training, compressed into the shape of a night shift nurse at Mercy General in Raleigh, North Carolina. She stood, returned the file, and clocked in for her evening shift at 6:45 p.m., her face composed and her voice steady when she signed the ASL designation form to serve as Marcus Rivera's communication nurse for the night. The room went quiet when she stepped into his unit. Other nurses recognized something in her movement, in the set of her shoulders, in the way she walked like someone who'd learned to move through space without disturbing the silence. Nobody could have said what they were recognizing. They had no language for it. But something had changed in the way they looked at the night shift nurse, a small recalibration in the way the invisible hierarchy of a hospital begins to reorganize itself. Sarah pulled on her gloves, checked his monitors, and began her shift with the particular focus of someone who'd already decided that 12 doctors refusing care meant something very specific. It meant this patient was hers alone. And whatever happened next, she would be ready. Sarah signed the ASL consent form at 6:58 p.m., her signature clean and precise on the line that designated her as Marcus Rivera's official communication nurse for the duration of his stay. The hospital's legal department required it, a paper trail protecting Mercy General from liability when a patient couldn't hear verbal instructions. She didn't think about the irony. She'd been trained to move through systems, not question them. The consent form went into his chart. His chart went back to the nurse's station. Dr. Hargrove was waiting there. He held Marcus's file like it was evidence of something criminal, his expensive fountain pen clicking against his teeth in a rhythm that made the hair on her neck stand up. When he saw her, his expression shifted into something carefully measured. "Nurse Chen." Perfect timing. She turned to face him. "Waited. I'm assigning you as the primary communication liaison for our deaf patient in Trauma Bay 3. He said primary like it was a compliment. His voice carried the weight of someone making a generous gesture. "You'll be responsible for all his care directives, all his medical updates, all his consent discussions. Nobody else communicates with him. You understand? This is a liability issue. The hospital needs a single consistent interpreter interface. You're it." Sarah's jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough for someone trained to read micro-expressions. She understood what he was actually saying: you are responsible for every failure. Every complication. Every bad outcome that comes from communication breaking down will have your name on it. "I'm fluent in ASL," she said. "I can handle the assignment. I'm sure you can handle many things." His pen clicked twice more. But I want to be clear, this patient is high risk. Complex case. The entire medical team is stretched thin tonight. You'll be his communication point. If he crashes, if anything goes wrong, you'll be the one explaining to legal why decisions weren't made correctly. You're the bottleneck. The bridge. Understood. It wasn't a question. He turned and walked back toward his office without waiting for her answer, his Italian leather shoes squeaking slightly on the tile floor. Sarah understood perfectly. He'd just handed her a loaded weapon and made sure she'd be holding it when the firing started. She went to Trauma Bay 3. Marcus was asleep, his breathing steady, monitors beeping their reassuring rhythm. The 4-line Hargroves team had placed hung saline at a steady drip. Stable. Waiting. She pulled the chair close and sat where she could watch his face, where he'd see her immediately when he woke. The boots, still in her locker upstairs, she reminded herself. Later. After. One thing at a time. At 10:38 p.m., the intercom crackled to life with a voice that made 3 nurses on the floor freeze. Attention all personnel. Mass casualty drill initiated. Level 3 severity. Lockdown on surgical floor in effect. All available physicians report to Conference Room B immediately for triage assignment. The announcements continued, detailed, official, carrying the weight of protocol. Mass casualty drills happened maybe twice a year. Sarah had participated in dozens of them during her active service. She knew the rhythm, all hands on deck, all departments mobilized, non-critical cases left with skeleton crews. The surgical floor locked down. Red light over the stairwell. All available doctors vanished within 90 seconds, pulled into the choreography of simulated crisis. Sarah was alone in Trauma Bay 3 when Marcus's blood pressure dropped from 112 to 89 in 3 minutes. When it hit 76, his breathing became labored. Shallow. His eyes snapped open, wide and panicked, hands gripping the bed rails. She could read his face like a field report, pain, confusion, pressure in his chest, something wrong internally and growing worse. Cardiac tamponade. The blood collecting around his heart, restricting the chambers, strangling his cardiac output. She'd seen it once before. Ramadi. A Marine with shrapnel in his chest cavity, lungs getting compressed, heart basically being squeezed by its own protective sac. She signed to him, "I'm here. I'm going to help. Trust me." His eyes locked on hers. Recognition flickered, not of her face, not yet, but of someone who moved like they had a plan. Like they'd been here before. Like they weren't panicking. Muscle memory took over. Her hands moved toward the crash cart with the fluid precision of someone who'd trained to move through medical emergencies the way other people moved through their living rooms. No hesitation. No second guessing. The ultrasound machine was in the corner. It took her 7 seconds to wheel it over. She grabbed the sterile pericardiocentesis kit from the resuscitation shelf, hand steady as they'd been in Ramadi when she diffused explosives while taking small arms fire from 2 directions. 22 years old, holding steady under conditions that broke most people. Some things don't leave you. She positioned the probe beneath his xiphoid process, the small bony point at the base of his sternum. The ultrasound flickered to life, grayscale, precise, showing her exactly what she needed to see. The dark fluid collection compressing his heart. Pericardial sac distended like a balloon being inflated from the inside. His chambers were being crushed. "This is going to relieve the pressure," she signed as she prepped the needle. "Don't move." She found the angle, that precise approach between his ribs, the needle path that minimized risk and maximized access. The 18-gauge needle went in with a whisper of resistance, piercing through skin and muscle and pericardial membrane. Her eye stayed on the ultrasound image. Depth. Angle. Precision. The moment the needle entered the fluid collection, dark blood filled the syringe. 50 cubic centimeters. She withdrew slowly, steadily. 100 cubic centimeters. The pressure in his chest was already easing. She could see it in his breathing, deeper, less labored. 150 cubic centimeters. His heart chambers starting to expand again. 200 cubic centimeters. At 200 cubic centimeters, his blood pressure began to climb. 75 systolic. Then 85. Then 98. Still dropping from normal, but alive. Climbing. Stabilizing. His eyes fluttered open, more present now, more conscious. Looking directly at her face. She documented everything with hands that didn't shake, not yet. The procedure note went into his chart with exact times: 10:49 p.m., pericardiocentesis initiated. 10:52 p.m., 200 cubic centimeters drained. 10:54 p.m., vitals stabilized. Ultrasound images printed and placed in the file, timestamp visible on every frame. The evidence of what she'd done, written in medical shorthand that would be understood by anyone who knew how to read it. The surgical floor doors unlocked at 11:03 p.m. The drill was concluded. Physicians filtered back from the conference room, checking their pages, returning to their patients. Back to normal. Back to the pretense that the evening had been routine. Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway of Trauma Bay 3 at 11:17 p.m., took one look at Marcus Rivera's stable vital signs and the ultrasound images in his chart, and his face went carefully blank. Not angry. Not yet. Just cold. The kind of cold that came from calculations shifting in real time. Nurse Chen. My office. Now. She stood, left Marcus with a sign, "Be back soon," and followed him down the corridor. The hallway fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical hum. She could smell the antiseptic from the cleaning crew's evening rounds, mixed with something else. Coffee. Old coffee from someone's abandoned mug. His office was exactly what she'd expected. Mahogany desk. Framed degrees from Georgetown and Johns Hopkins. Family photo with a woman who looked unhappy in the way of someone married to ambition. 2 empty chairs in front of the desk arranged to face him like a courtroom setup. He gestured for her to sit. She remained standing. The suspension letter was already waiting on his desk, printed and signed. She caught the date without picking it up, dated 3 hours earlier. This afternoon. Before the drill. Before she'd ever touched the pericardiocentesis kit. The letter was prepared, waiting only for her performance to give it meaning. Unauthorized performance of physician-level procedures, Hargrove read, his voice carrying the weight of bureaucratic regret. Sarah Chen, RN, performed a pericardiocentesis without physician supervision, without prior authorization, and without evidence of formal training in advanced interventional techniques. The patient was in cardiac arrest, she said. Neutral. Factual. All physicians were locked in the surgical floor drill. Which is precisely why this is so concerning. You made a command decision in the absence of physician oversight. That's not nursing, Sarah. That's practicing medicine without a license. That's a felony. 2 board members appeared in the doorway then, Henderson, the chief of medicine, and Wu, from risk management. She'd seen them in the hallway before. Golf buddies, she'd heard. The institutional architecture that held men like Hargrove in place. We've reviewed the incident, Henderson said, already shaking his head. This is outside scope of practice. Way outside, Wu added, the tone of someone following a script. A third man appeared behind them. Retired police detective, maybe early 60s, wearing the particular exhaustion of someone who got paid to find problems. His badge was clipped to his belt, Dietrich. Hargrove's investigator. The pieces were assembling themselves. Ms. Chen, Dietrich said, I need to ask you some questions about your clinical background. Specifically, your previous employment and training. Hargrove leaned back in his chair, very still. Your references list a VA medical center in North Carolina. I had Dietrich call them this afternoon. The number's been disconnected for 3 years. The facility doesn't have any record of a Sarah Chen ever working there. Which is strange, because that's what your resume says. 3 years of ICU experience. Trauma specialization. Sarah's voice stayed level. The facility closed. Consolidated with Wilmington. They gave us a transfer number. It's also disconnected. Hargrove picked up his pen. Clicked it once. Your Navy discharge paperwork lists a position that doesn't exist anymore. Your background check, the original one when you were hired, was processed through a private contractor who apparently went out of business. We're having difficulty verifying your credentials, Nurse Chen. This was the move. This was how it worked. Not the medical competence, that was secondary. The real weapon was documentation. Institutional paper. The systematic questioning of who she was, where she'd been, what she could prove. I have my RN license, she said. Yes. Your current license is legitimate. But the work history prior to that license is proving difficult to verify. We're going to need you to suspend all clinical duties while we investigate. It wasn't a suspension yet. It was the setup. The paperwork that would make the suspension legitimate when it came. She drove home at 2:07 a.m. with a cardboard box on the passenger seat. The contents of her locker, a stethoscope, 2 pens, a water bottle with her name written in faded marker, and the combat boots. The boots sat on top of everything else, their leather creased and worn, the laces still tied in a double knot from the last time she'd worn them 7 years ago. She parked in her driveway and sat in the dark, her hand still steady on the steering wheel, her breathing still controlled. In her head, she ran through the tactical map, the people who knew, the people who could verify, the people who'd been there that night in Ramadi. Most of them were dead. Some of them were classified. None of them were going to answer the phone to a hospital investigator asking questions about a woman who'd officially never existed. The rain started at 2:14 a.m. Heavy. Loud against the car roof. She sat in the dark and listened to it hammer down like a countdown to something she couldn't yet see. Lightning flashed, illuminating her daughter's bedroom window upstairs, her daughter asleep, innocent of what was about to land on their lives. Sarah picked up the combat boots and held them in her hands the way some people hold rosaries, not for prayer, but for remembering. For grounding. For reminding herself of exactly who and what she was underneath the scrubs and the suppressed voice and the careful deference. A decorated senior chief petty officer. A woman who'd cleared buildings in Ramadi. A woman who'd carried a wounded Marine 5 miles through hostile fire on her shoulders. A woman who'd been designed and trained and tested by the best operators this country had ever produced. And right now, she was alone in a car in Raleigh with a box of her possessions and a hospital investigator who was about to discover that her entire previous identity had been erased on purpose. The next person who walked into her life and needed her to be who she really was would be arriving in exactly 3 nights. By morning, Dr. Hargrove had moved with the precision of a man executing a final offensive. 2 board members, Henderson and Wu, both regulars at his Friday golf rounds, had already filed formal complaints. Henderson's call came at 7:02 a.m. to the North Carolina Nursing Board, requesting an immediate license review. Wu's email hit the hospital's malpractice insurer at 8:03 a.m., flagging an unauthorized advanced procedure incident that could void coverage. The board members didn't know what they were actually protecting. They only knew Hargrove's version, a floor nurse performing procedures outside her scope, risking Medicare certification, costing the hospital millions. Investigator Dietrich, the one Hargrove had personally hired, pulled Sarah's employment application by noon. 4-year gap. Listed as private care nursing. References that no longer existed. He made phone calls to a VA office in D.C. that had been disconnected for 5 years. He tried 3 different numbers. Deadlines, all of them. Nothing connected. He documented everything in a report thick with question marks, and by 1:15 p.m., he'd presented it to Administrator Chen, a different Chen, no relation, recommending immediate suspension pending a full investigation. But that wasn't the worst part. At 1:27 p.m., in a closed-door meeting on the third floor, Hargrove sat across from Administrator Chen and presented his case like a surgeon presenting a malignancy. The documents were laid out in careful order, the pericardiocentesis procedure, completely outside her nursing license. The patient outcome, coincidentally positive but medically impossible without formal training. The timeline gaps in her background. The liability exposure. The risk to the hospital's federal funding. His voice stayed even and reasonable the entire time, the kind of calm that comes from having already prepared the battlefield. "We can't keep her," Hargrove said. "Not with Medicare breathing down our necks." Administrator Chen signed the termination order at 2:31 p.m. The certified letter arrived at Sarah's address at 6:17 p.m., carried in a brown envelope with a signature requirement she wasn't home to provide. When the postal carrier left it on the porch, it sat there for 3 hours before Emma brought it inside, reading the first sentence and going very still. Sarah was still at the kitchen table when Emma found her at noon the next day. The letter was spread before her like a confession. Terminated for cause. Unauthorized procedure. Gross misconduct. Failure to maintain professional boundaries with a patient. The words sat there on the page like stones. Her shoulders had been shaking for 6 hours. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just the kind of silent tremor that comes when someone has been holding things together so tightly for so long that even the fabric starts to come apart. Her scrubs were still on, she'd never changed. The badge with her name and photo was on the table beside the letter, the laminate beginning to peel at one corner. Emma came down the stairs at noon, backpack over her shoulder, heading to her volunteer shift at the hospital, the one place in Raleigh where her mother had taught her that healing was possible. She stopped 3 feet from the kitchen table. "Mom? Why are you home early?" The voice was sharp with confusion, the kind of sharp that comes from a 15-year-old who has only ever seen her mother work, plan, survive, and keep moving. Emma had never seen Sarah Chen cry. She'd seen her mother clean 147 sutures without anesthesia. She'd seen her silent when nightmares woke her at 3 a.m. She'd seen her hand steady enough to rebuild a transmission engine. But this, shoulders curved inward like she was trying to fold into herself, this was new. Sarah wiped her face with the back of her hand. The gesture was automatic, military, almost dismissive. "I saved someone's life." "I know. That's what you do." "And got fired for it." Emma read the letter. The fury that crossed her face was immediate and absolute. "This is bullshit, Mom. You're the best nurse in that hospital." Language. But Sarah was almost smiling. Almost. What neither of them knew was that Marcus Rivera was asking for the nurse who'd saved him. His sister had called the hospital that morning to check on his recovery, and the day shift had told her he'd been signing the same description over and over for hours. A woman. Dark hair. Hands that moved like she knew exactly what they were doing. A face that made him feel like he was remembering something he'd never known. Sarah returned to Mercy General that evening as a visitor, not staff, moving through the hallways like a ghost haunting the place that had broken her. She used the stairs instead of the elevators. Avoided the main corridor. Found Marcus's room on the 3rd floor, the one with a single chair beside the bed and a window overlooking the parking lot where her car now sat in the visitor section instead of the employee lot. Marcus was sitting up, reading a discharge summary with an interpreter beside him. When he saw Sarah's face in the doorway, his entire body went rigid. She signed slowly, her hands moving with the same precision she'd used threading a needle through a pericardial sac. "You're doing better." His hands trembled as he signed back. "You saved my life." "How did you know what to do?" She hesitated. The truth was 3 tours in Ramadi. For years of Navy medical training. 1,000 hours patching men open on compound floors while rounds snapped overhead. A commendation that still existed in classified files somewhere in the Pentagon basement. "I had good training," she signed. He studied her face, something flickering in his eyes, not quite recognition, but a sense of familiarity he couldn't place. like he was standing at the edge of a memory that kept dissolving before he could reach it. Meanwhile, in his office, Dr. Hargrove was making his final moves. Board member Henderson had already contacted the state nursing board. Wu had flagged her for the malpractice insurer. Investigator Dietrich had documented enough discrepancies to make her background look like a fraud. By 4 p.m., Hargrove had activated the final piece, a call to her VA employment history, knowing the number had been disconnected on purpose 5 years ago when she'd erased that entire life from official record. The permanent termination letter came through the hospital's system at 5:43 p.m. Forwarded to her home address. Certified. Final. Sarah received it at 7:22 p.m., standing in her driveway with the box she'd carried from her locker in one hand and the letter in the other. She didn't open it until she was inside, the door locked, the house silent except for the kitchen clock ticking off the seconds of her second erasure. Emma found her at the kitchen table again, but this time Sarah wasn't crying. She was staring at the pair of worn combat boots that she kept in the bottom of her locker, the ones from Ramadi, still stained with dust from streets she'd promised herself she'd never return to. The boots she'd carried every shift for 7 years as a reminder of who she'd been when the world had needed her, before the world had disappeared and she'd had to disappear with it. "Mom," Emma whispered. "Who were you before you were my mom?" Sarah's face had gone completely still. The kind of still that comes right before something breaks open. "Someone," Sarah said, "that you're about to meet." The FBI arrived at 2:47 in the morning with a man in a wheelchair and a face Sarah hadn't seen in 7 years except in classified briefings stamped with red lettering. The bomb maker. The one who triggered the IED that took Marcus's hearing and nearly took his life. Federal escort. Prison transfer bracelet catching the fluorescent light like a dark prophecy. The prisoner's eyes opened during the examination, not the eyes of a man sedated for transport, but eyes that focused with the precision of someone trained in reading rooms, reading threats, reading the hands of a woman she'd once tried to kill. His hands began moving before his voice could form words. Tactical sign language. The battlefield dialect she and Marcus had learned in those contested streets of Ramadi, and shaping stories that had no translation in the civilian world. His fingers trembled as they formed the letters. You are the one they called the Angel of Ramadi. The room should have held 12 doctors. Instead, it held silence, and then it held truth arriving like a helicopter that nobody had called. Emma stepped forward from the volunteer station where she'd been restocking supplies during the night shift. Sarah's daughter. 15 years old and carrying her mother's jawline and her mother's capacity to move with purpose through chaos. Emma's voice cut through the stunned air with the precision of a scalpel. My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, U.S. Navy Special Warfare. The sentence landed like a detonation. The orderlies froze. The monitor's beeping seemed suddenly too loud, too urgent, as if the machines themselves understood that the room had shifted on its axis. An FBI agent's hand moved to his phone. A nurse's chart clattered against the metal tray. Emma didn't blink. She looked at her mother the way Marcus Rivera was about to look at her, the way a person looks at someone they've been searching for in the dark. 2 floors up in the surgical ward, Marcus sat up despite the chest tubes and the pain medication and the weight of 7 years of not knowing. A nurse rushed to stabilize him, but Marcus pushed her hand away with the kind of strength that comes from understanding something fundamental about the world rearranging itself. His eyes locked on the bomber's file the FBI agent had placed on the counter. His hands began moving. Not speech. Not even the careful sign language of the deaf community. This was military. This was memory made physical. His fingers shaped the words as the interpreter translated them aloud, though every person in the room could see the citations being signed into existence. Silver Star. Marcus signed it like a prayer. Pause. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilators wheeze. Bronze Star with Vela. Another pause. His hand shook now, but not from weakness. Purple Heart. Purple Heart. Purple Heart. 3 times. The bomb had taken his hearing but hadn't taken his memory of who'd pulled him from the rubble. The hospital cafeteria doors burst open at 3 o'clock in the morning, and a man in full Navy dress white stepped through. SEAL Team 3 insignia on his chest. The kind of commander who moves through rooms like he owns the air itself, presence that made the pressure change, that made subordinates straighten without understanding why. His eyes found Sarah in approximately half a second, and his face transformed into something between shock and recognition and a respect so profound it seemed to generate its own gravity. Senior Chief Chen led the operation that dismantled the Ramadi bombing network. He announced to the gathering crowd, which had grown to include night shift staff, security, an administrator who'd been called from home, the FBI agent, the interpreter, 3 nurses, and the bomb maker in his wheelchair, listening to words being spoken about a war he'd lost. She personally saved 14 American lives in a single night. 14. That's the official count. The commander stepped closer to Sarah, and his voice dropped to a frequency that only she could hear. I served under your command, Senior Chief. Every person in this room should know your name. Dr. Hargrove stood in the back corner where he'd arrived 5 minutes earlier, still dressed in street clothes, having been called by security to explain why his hospital credentials had been flagged in a federal investigation. His face had gone the color of old bone. His mouth opened and closed with the mechanical repetition of a fish drowning in air. An FBI agent, not the one escorting the prisoner, but a second one who'd arrived with files thick enough to constitute their own gravitational field, approached Dr. Hargrove with the kind of smile that carried no warmth. Dr. Hargrove, you're going to want to review your billing practices with an attorney. We have documentation of Medicare fraud spanning 6 years. 14 instances of unnecessary procedures billed to federal insurance. Systematic refusal of Medicaid patients. And pressure placed on colleagues to maintain what your texts refer to as profitable patient ratios. That language, by the way, appears in written communications. With board members Henderson and Wu. The agent held up a subpoena. 12 doctors submitted statements tonight. 11 describe pressure from you to refuse difficult cases. One of them has produced text messages. The investigation now includes a federal prosecutor, the Medicare Fraud Task Force, and the State Medical Board. You'll want legal representation. Dr. Hargrove's jaw tightened. His hands flexed at his sides. His eyes found Sarah across the room, and for a single moment, his composure cracked like pottery dropped on tile. This was a man who understood exactly what was about to happen. The security guard who'd handed Sarah her belongings in a cardboard box yesterday, a man whose name was Thomas and who'd been fighting the system his entire career, walked toward Dr. Hargrove with an identical cardboard box in his hands. His voice carried the weight of finality. I believe you know the way out, sir. Your office is sealed. Your credentials are deactivated pending review. You have 15 minutes to collect personal items. After that, you're trespassing on federal property. The box landed in Dr. Hargrove's hands. His medical journals. His diplomas. The small bronze plaque commemorating his service to the community. All of it reduced to a box he had to hold or let fall. He left at 3:32 in the morning, walking past the gathered staff with the gait of a man who'd finally understood that power was temporary, that the people he'd threatened were the ones who actually mattered, that 15 years of manipulating the system had collapsed in the time it took to make 3 phone calls. The room didn't cheer. It simply watched him go. 6 months later, Sarah drove past a strip mall on Route 64 during her morning commute to Mercy General. There was Dr. Hargrove, sitting at a folding table in front of a Dollar General, a banner above his head reading supplemental insurance, affordable coverage. His tie was loosened. His face had weathered in a way that suggested the 6 months had contained more than 6 months' worth of consequence. He was explaining a deductible to an elderly woman who listened with the patience of someone who had nowhere else to be. Sarah's car passed before he looked up. She didn't slow down. Inside Mercy General, the emergency department had transformed like a room breathing for the first time in years. ASL training was now mandatory for all staff. Communication protocols were posted on every wall. A patient advocacy board included Marcus Rivera, who now coordinated services and translated for deaf patients with the fluency of someone who'd learned the language of being unseen and had decided no one else would have to live like that. The 12 doctors who'd refused Marcus came from different schools of thought now. 8 remained at Mercy General, humbled and reformed, now working under departmental guidelines that made it clear no patient may be refused treatment due to communication needs, insurance status, or complexity of care. Fahad left rather than adapt. That was the cost of staying attached to the old way. Sarah climbed the stairs to the administrative floor where her new office waited. The nameplate on the door read Dr. Sarah Chen, Director of Emergency Medicine. The hospital had sponsored her medical degree completion, recognizing her field training as equivalent credit, understanding that some teachers couldn't be found in textbooks. She placed the worn combat boots on the shelf beside her diplomas, the Silver Star citation, and a photo of Emma in her nursing school acceptance letter. The leather was cracked from 7 years of night shifts. The soles were worn thin from walking corridors that had felt like war zones even when they were purely medical. The boots had been her anchor, her reminder of who she'd been. Now they were her evidence of who she'd become. Marcus appeared in her doorway at 7 o'clock, ready for the morning briefing. He signed, "Ready." Sarah signed back, "Always ready." As she walked to the conference room, she passed a new poster in the hallway, part of the culture change she'd mandated on her first day. It showed a nurse's hands and a soldier's boots, and text below in English and ASL. "You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior." The morning light through the windows caught the small anchor tattoo on her wrist, the one she'd gotten after leaving the Navy, the reminder she'd thought she needed to stay grounded. But she didn't need reminders anymore. She was exactly who she'd always been meant to be. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, hit that notification bell, and comment below. If you could change one thing about how hospitals treat patients with communication barriers, what would it be? Your stories matter.